Alright, today I'm going to be discussing materials, specifically arc and design materials, the mental ray shader for 3D Studio Max, different materials in this tutorial. They cover all the way from plastics, cloths, chrome, glass to paint and wood. So hopefully we'll cover enough to discuss the all the important principles of materials. If you look at the scene right now, I've got basically it's a very simple box, and I have a very simple lighting scheme. I'll show it to you real quick right here. It's basically a box, and I've got four mental ray sky portals. I could get into the simple lighting of this scene, but because this is a tutorial for texturing, I'm not going to get into the details of the lighting, but it is on the file, so if you want to get into the lighting you can take a look at it. So let's jump into the materials here. Let's get back to our okay, and right now everything has a 50% white material, so if you were to look at the scene right now, this is what it looks like. It's basically your general scene. I've got two chairs, a table, and the room, and we're going to, hopefully by the end of this we'll be texturing the entire thing. So let's jump into our first material, which is the white plastic. And I brought in this seat. It's an architectural design that many people have seen before, but we'll be doing white plastic, which is this. I'm going to cover this in white plastic right here, and of course we want to get to the color first. Here's the diffuse color, and we're going to make it white. Now, if you want to be technically accurate, nothing in reality is 100% white. It's got a little bit of gray in it, and probably nothing is more than 9.2, 9.8 maybe, but 9.0 is probably what we're looking for. In a mental ray, the colors that go from 0 to 1, you think of them as these percentages. This is 90% red, 90% green, 90% blue. They're all the same. Of course, we're going to have a gray color, so that's our color for that. I want to make it a little reflective as well, so we'll give it some reflection, and right now here we can see that it's a little reflective, and right now if we were to render it, it would be purely glossy, 100%. So this means that it's not scattering any of our reflection. Because it's a plastic, it's not going to be 100% reflective like a chrome, so it's going to scatter some of our reflection. So for this, I'm going to make it 0.5. Okay. Now if we were to render it, I'm just going to render that little area right there. So to do that, we can click on our render settings, go to our comment tab, and instead of rendering the entire frame, I'm just going to do a crop, and it's going to show me, let's close this, it's going to show me the area that I want to render, my crop view. So that's what I want for my crop, and I'll just hit render, and we'll see what that material looks like. And for the speed of this tutorial, I'm going to be pausing between renderings. So as it's rendering, I'll stop it, and it will pick back up after the rendering's done. Okay, so the rendering's done, and we can see that we're getting some reflection from our sunlight right here, and you can see it's all that reflection. It's hard to tell that's white because everything else in the scene is white, but you'll see as we add colors to the walls and the table, it'll reflect a lot of those colors as well. Now to get some of this reflection a little more refined, we'll come back to that later, but we can add a more scattering, more sampling to this. For now, I'm pretty happy with where it is, and we'll leave it right there. So the next material I'm going to of this seat. A lot of times you would want to use a texture map for the cloth, but because you're so far away, in reality, if you took a photo of your sofa, you wouldn't actually see the fabric of the cloth. So normally it's okay to just put a color, and that's what we're going to do. So the color I want to use for this is kind of like an orange color, orangey color, I guess you could say. So that's looking pretty good. I want it to be much brighter, but that's the color I want. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Now to do cloth, there are two ways you could do this. You could, a lot of people will go into the color slot of your diffuse channel and use a fall off, and they'll, for the front side, they'll put one color, and for the edges they'll put another color, and gives it a velvety look. That's one way to do it. An easy way to do it in this shader is to play with the roughness. And here, to make it look like cloth, we're going to make it 0.85. And you can see all of a sudden it's much rougher. So let's go back to 0 and you'll see what this shader looks like. So here's 0 right there. And you can see it just looks like a ball. And we put it at 0.85. Yeah, all of a sudden it becomes more rough. So let's go ahead and render that and see what it looks like. Okay, you can see right off the bat that it doesn't look anything like our color we picked. And the reason for that is because mental ray photographic exposure. If you hit 8 on your keyboard, it's not working for really the color that we want it to look like, but watch what happens when we render it. Okay, you can see now we've got these rich, the rich orange color which I originally picked. It doesn't look anything like that in the rendering. It does, and it's a kind of a trick that works for mental ray photographic exposure. For these parametric colors, it works. There's another solution that applies. It applies to texture maps, and I'll show you how to do that a little later. So it's looking fairly good. The nice thing about these Arc and Design materials is it's got a lot of functions like ambient occlusion, which we'll add. You can see the colors look good, but it looks a little flat, and so what we can do down to special effects and open that up. There's an ambient occlusion slot in there, and we can use that to add some of that shadow in the places where the geometry meets. Basically, ambient occlusion is increasing your soft shadows where objects meet each other, and the max distance is 4 inches where it falls off. So this I usually apply to all my materials, and it's nice because with the Arc and Design material you can cater by the actual material. So if you're getting too much shadow on one material, you can actually bring it down on one material without it affecting the rest of them. So it's a nice feature. So now you can see we're getting some of these really nice soft shadows, and our geometry is really popping out much more now. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the cloth. Let's take a look at chrome on this table leg. I'm going to go ahead and move my crop window over this table leg right here, and let's go ahead and minimize this material editor. So here's my table, and I'm going to make the legs of this a chrome material. There's several tricks to doing chrome. The first thing to note about chrome is that there isn't an actual color chrome, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around, because it's 100% reflective. And so for the color, bring it down to something more like 0.07. So it's actually fairly dark. So I'm pretty happy with that. Another thing about chrome is it's very reflective, and so I'm going to increase this all the way up to 1. When it's at 1, it means it's going to reflect 100% of everything you're seeing. And then is a factor of your color. So this is the color that it's reflecting. It's going to be 100% reflective, and it's going to be white. So which means it's going to reflect white, essentially, of your environment. I'm also going to add something interesting. I'm going to add a fall off to the color. I'm going to add a Fresnel fall off. So let's add a fall off, and let's make it Fresnel. What I'm trying to tell it is on the front side I want it to be 100% reflective, and on the edges of the chrome I want it to be opaque, so we do get some of that texture. Now right now it doesn't look like it's very reflective. Another factor is there's a built-in fall off here, the BRDF, which is actually bidirectional reflectance distribution function, and this is a factor of what is reflective in the perpendicular direction to what is reflective in the parallel direction. So this right here, we're changing what is reflective on the edges, or sorry, not on the edges, on what. So you can see as I pull it up, it's becoming more invisible. That's because it's reflecting the environment. So we're going to put it not quite that high, maybe 0.7, something like that. So now we can kind of see our material's getting that reflection that we want. If you want to see what it looks like, you can turn the checkered on and you can see how much it's reflecting. Now if we were to bring this down, you'll see it's not going to reflect as much of the environment. So that's kind of how that works. So we're going to make that reflective. Function for chrome, because it's metal, it reflects, it kind of has a texture to the reflection. And you can control that by changing its anisotropic features. For this, I'm going to change it down to 0.02, which is kind of a standard I do, and you can see it's scattering the reflection. So it's kind of, you would use this on brushed metal, that kind of material. So I'm fairly with the way that looks. Let's go ahead and render it and see what it looks like. Okay, it's coming out fairly nicely. You can see we're getting this nice reflection from our floor, so it's working the way I want it to. And these, you're also getting highlights up here from the window, even though it's a little spotted. That's just because the spots are just because the sampling's low. And we can fix that, all that kind of stuff later. But for now, I'm fairly happy with it. Move on to the glass. General glass is fairly simple. It's reflective. I like to make it 100% reflective and 100% refractive. And refractive, once you pull this up, the refraction actually bends the way the geometry looks within the glass. And this right here is your index of refraction. And if you remember from physics class, different materials have different indexes of refraction. If you hover over this, it'll tell you, it actually tells you refractions of different materials. For glass, it's 1.4. We'll just leave it at that. You see crown glass right there is 1.52, but for this example, we'll just leave it like that. And then the color of your glass is not so much a factor of the diffuse color. For this example, we'll just make it black. You can see it's not really affecting the color of the material so much. What actually determines the color of the glass more than anything is changing the slot. And you can see Max is giving you that pop-up, the easiest way to create colored glass. So these pop-ups are very helpful. So if you don't really know what you're doing, you hover over it. They're pretty good as far as the documentation that goes with that. For the refraction, let's give it a color like a bluish, greenish tint. Let's see here. Something like that. That's probably pretty good. And you want to keep it fairly light. You don't want to go too dark. But let's see. Let's try this. Yeah, that's fairly good. You don't want to go too dark though. Let's go ahead and render that and see what it looks like. Okay, so you can see that now it's reflective, and we're also getting some nice color on the ground. You can see we're getting some nice color on the floor from the texturing, from the color of the glass. So it's giving us some nice ambient color to our scene. You can also see that this reflection right here in the glass is reflecting the seat. So that's fairly successful. I'm fairly happy with that. Let's move on to the other seat. Now this seat, you may have seen it before. It's in a lot of the V-Ray for SketchUp tutorials and sessions. But this is the seat I'm using. I'm using it because it's got a lot of nice bend and curves. And this is the seat. I'm actually going to make it a plastic seat, kind of a transparent plastics. So I've got my shader here called plastic. And to make it transparent, again, we change the transparency and bring that up to 1. So now it's 100% transparent. It also needs to be reflective. So we'll go ahead and make it reflective. And it looks just like our other glass, which is fairly good. Now I'm going to give it some color. And the color, like we said, just like the glass, it's not so much a factor of the diffuse. So I'm going to make that, I'm going to make it blue. It is a little bit of a factor of the diffuse, but not as much as you think it would be. And I'll show you what I mean. So I've got my diffuse color. Let's go ahead and render it out. Let's render that out and see what it looks like. That you don't see any blue, and it's clear. You would have no idea that I put blue in the diffuse slot. And so it's not really a factor of your diffuse levels, and that's something that understand when you're dealing with refraction. The two factors, there is a reflection factor, and this determines the colors. I said this before, it determines the reflection of everything that is in your scene. So you can see the seat here is you got your white and your orange from the, now if I change this to a different color, if I change it for example to a bluish color, then we will start to get some blue reflections. And so I'm going to use a value of let's go 125. There we go, that's a good color. So let's go ahead and render that out and see what happens. Okay, you can see it hasn't changed the color of the material, but it has changed the color of the reflections. So anything that's white is actually getting filtered with this color, the blue color. So now the reflections have this blue color to it. So that's for the reflections. And that's actually what we want. It's going to be reflecting that blue color because the seat's going to be blue. What actually makes the seat blue here is our refraction though. And that's the color that we need to make a blue as well. Let's make it, let's see here. Let's try, I'm just trying these values out. 0.7, that's pretty good. Now it's very faint, but you can see all of a sudden what it's done to our shader. And these colors in the refraction color slot need to be very light, end up with some very strong colors, and it's kind of fun to play with them. You'll end up getting some really interesting results. They don't work the way you think they would, but to get a little bit of color in your refraction in your slot, it goes a long way. You can see what's happening here. It's going quite far, and we're actually getting the blue seat that we want. See, so now it seems like the seat is blue, even though the only thing we've changed is the color of the transparency. And that's actually what we're going for, and that's quite good. Now I'm going to move on to the materials in the room, the walls and the floors. So to do that, I'm going to change my render area from crop to view. So it's actually going to render the entire view of this. And the first material I'm going to get to is going to be the floors here. I'm going to do a concrete for the floors. Use a map for that. Anytime you use a map in 3D Max, you want to use you want to control it with a UV UVW modifier, which is what I've added here. So this here is the UVW map that I added, and I put it on box so that all four sides of whatever my geometry is, which is this room, will reflect that map. And I put on real world map size. And I like to use real world map to know exactly what size my texture maps are in real world space. So, you know, everything is in feet and in inches, and that way I know my materials can be scaled properly. So now that I've got my modifier on, I can go ahead and add a map. And we're going to add a bitmap. And we'll let it load here. And I'm going to use my smooth concrete material. Now, I've got it in here to see in the scene. You check this box right here, and you can see the material. And let's turn off F4 to turn off our wireframe. And you can see it's tiled very small. You want to check real world scale in the map slot because we're using real world map in our modifier. So let's check that. And then the size of it, this is you kind of want to play with it. So I'm going to make it 3 feet, tile it by 3 feet by 3 feet. And you can see we're starting to get some texturing. And let me turn the grid off so we can see. Oops, not in there. 3 feet. Let's turn our grid off in the scene. So there we go. You can see there's our material. I want to make it a little bigger, so I'm going to go by 5 feet. And actually in Max it actually changes it to 412, which is kind of an interesting anomaly. So now we've got our material in the slot, and we know it's tiled. The map we're using, which is this image right here, is tiled from here to here, which is 5 feet, and from here to down here is another 5 feet. And there's a little stretching going on because it's not quite a square, it's a little rectangular, but we can get away with it. The blurring amount, I also play with the blurring amount. If I'm dealing with an image, I'll turn it down. You don't want to turn it down too far. This is as low as you can turn it down in Max, but if you turn it down too far, you will get aliasing in your rendering. But that's the map that we want to use. I'm fairly happy with that. Alright, our concrete is also reflective. In reality, all materials are reflective, some more than others, but everything is, from paper to carpet, everything's going to have some reflection. In this case, it's going to be our concrete, and I'm going to give it a reflection value of 2. And it's not going to be glossy at all, so I'm going to give that a glossiness of 0.2 as well. And you can't even tell that it's reflective right here. So we're going to leave that the way it is. What else? I'm going to change. I think that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and render it and see what it looks like. Okay, here's our concrete, and there are a couple things going on. Firstly, you can tell that we are getting some reflection by these little dots on the floor, little speckles. We're having a hard time seeing the texture, the actual texture map, and it's light for the same reason that the orange in our seat cushion was very light. We're going to bring the output in this map down and make it darker so we can get some more of that texture in there. Also, I'm noticing that we're not getting some of the stuff, these materials like the seat and the table feels like they're standing off a little bit. We could put ambient occlusion on there and that would fix that. Also, to fix the speckling in here, we can apply any reflecting object, for example like this table leg, down to 6 feet. It's going to use my default setting, for glossy samples, and then as it gets lower, where all these scattered samples are, it's going up to these 10 points at half resolution. So there's a lot of factors, and you can change from half to a third all the way down to a fifth. I don't recommend going lower than a half. Of course you can go double, and then it's just going to slow your rendering down. At that point you might as well increase your samples, glossy samples. So we've got that going. Also, we're going to make our texture map a little darker because I couldn't really see it too much. One way to do it is go to Output and enable the color map, and then I'm going to change this curve from linear to, or from corner to a Bezier corner. And I'm going to grab this and pull it down back to 0. And you'll see all of a sudden my map has gotten darker. And it's the same trick. This is kind of the graphical representation of what we did for our seat cushion, multiplying everything by, or cubing everything basically. So let's go ahead and render, see what that looks like. Oh, and before I render that, I'm going to put an example of my rendering into the RAM player, so we get an example of a comparison of what our fast interpolation is doing to our rendering. So let's go ahead and render here. Okay, so now we're getting some nice soft reflections in our concrete, better to see, and it's a little darker than I was expecting, but you can see what's happening now. Let's go ahead and load it into the RAM player and we'll do a comparison, even though the colors are different. But you can see that here's a good example right here. Right here we're getting all these samples. These are just samples from the standard, the 8 samples per glossy reflection. And what's happening is some of them are disappearing. They're getting picked up lower than 6 feet by the fast glossy interpolation. And so it's actually keeping the detailed reflections near the geometries where they're touching, but as they get further, then it just uses the interpolation. So you can see, for example, right here, instead we can get the table leg, but instead of down here getting all these samples, they kind of just go away, and that's because it's using that fast glossy interpolation. It doesn't always work, but for this scenario, it works fairly nicely. So for now, we're going to keep it. So we are going to exit RAM player. So go ahead and close that. So I'm fairly happy with that. For now, let's keep the concrete the way it is, and we'll move on to the walls. And we'll work on this wall. Right now we are getting some noise that's not from a map, that's from the final gather. I'm rendering at very low sampling for the final gathering. Some of that's going to go away, and the texture is going to hide that, so I'm not too worried about that. And in the final render, I could render it out at a higher resolution, a higher sampling, and that will take care of that. Let me go ahead and turn on the wireframe so we can see our wall. Okay. So we'll move on to the brick right here. And for starting Macs aren't familiar with this navigation, this button right here is kind of like your out arrow in Windows Explorer, and I'm using a multi-sub object material. So for every ID, I have a different material, and you can apply that to one piece of geometry that have different IDs. For example, this right here, I've got different IDs. It's kind of how I like to work. So on the polygon, right now you can see I've got my floor select, and everything is on ID 1, which means it's concrete right here. So on my walls, if I were to select this, then it would be ID number 2, and that's my brick, and so on for the rest of the materials. It's kind of a nice way to work to keep your shaders simple without cluttering up your material editor. I like working this way. And when you click on one of these, it'll take you inside that material. This will take you back out, and this will go to the object at that level whether it's a map or the next shader. So right now we'll work with the brick. Brick is kind of an interesting material. There are a lot of different ways you can do it. I'm going to use a tile map and I'm going to use a texture map. It's a little complicated, but because we have our UVW map at real world scale, it's easy for me to keep track of in ways that make sense to you. So let's go ahead and add a tile map. Tile down at the bottom, alphabetical. So we'll pick tile and we'll apply it, or we'll show our, it's already applied, but we'll show it in the viewport. Right away you can see we're getting all this striations, and I'm going to turn off the wireframe. These striations, and that's because it's the tiles are very, 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 very small because map size on. So if I turn real world scale on, all of a sudden you can see we're at 1 inches, and our tile at 1 inch. So if we were to go to say 5 feet by 5 feet, we would get a grid that's literally 5 feet by 5 feet. And that's why I like working in real world space, because I know exactly how tall each of these boxes are. I know that that's 5 foot by 5 feet. So for bricks, brick we want to use, here I'm going to use king size brick because I like the way king size works. King size is a 3 by 10. It's not quite 3 by 10, but for simplifying this for our scene, for our purposes, it is 3 by 10. So I'm going to put my width is going to be 10 inches and my height is going to be 3 inches. And so there we go, we got 3 by 10. We look at that and you say, well, that's not quite. Well, why is that? The reason for this is because we've got this vertical count and a horizontal count. Now what this is doing is it's actually multiplying our width and height. So instead of 10, we're actually getting it's getting divided by 4. So you're actually getting that split in 4. So if you actually wanted a 3 by 10 block, we'd put that at 1 and put that at 1. There we go. Now we can see that we've got 3 by 10 blocks. Well, we don't want them, it's kind of hard to tell, but they're stacked. We don't want them stacked. We want them in a running bond pattern. And when I turn running bond on, it should be on. Our grout is a little difficult to see, but let's see if we can zoom in here. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's go ahead and zoom. Okay, so we've got bricks that are stacked at 3 by 10. Now the reason you're not seeing running bond is because running bond can't run at 1 by 1, so it's got to be at least 2 by 2 to get running bond. Okay, now these bricks aren't quite 3 by 10. They're actually half of that. They're 5 by 1.5, and that's because we've got our horizontal count at 2 and 2. So if we wanted to actually make this 3 by 10, we'd actually take these values and multiply them to our width and height. So this is actually going to be 20 inches, and this is actually 6 inches. Now, because we had our vertical count at 2 and our vertical count at 2 and horizontal count at 2, we multiplied our width and height by those to actually get our 3 by 10 bricks. And it's a little confusing. It doesn't say 3 by 10, but the combination of those two make the math work. Trust me, I've done this so many times that make your head spin. But that's actually a 3 by 10 brick, and it works. I'm not just going to leave it at that. You can change the color variance to make it look more natural. If you increase that, you'll see you start to get some variation in your brick. One other thing you start to notice is that it's not that random, and the reason is because this color variance is based on your horizontal count and your vertical count. To increase the variance, it's a factor of increasing your horizontal count and vertical count. So to get as much randomness as you can in your color variance, you want to increase your horizontal and vertical count as high as it can go. Now Max has a limit to this, which is 100. You see, as I've increased it to 100, now all we're seeing is really the grout. So let me increase these all the way to 100, and our grout size right now is 0.5. I'm going to decrease that to like 0.02, so we can kind of see what's going on. Okay, so now we got these tiny little bricks. Let's zoom in here. Tiny little bricks. To get back to our scale that we were at, we want to go multiply it by 100. So remember, our width is 10, so I'm going to say 10 times 100. You get 1,000 in that direction. And 3 times 100 is 300. Okay. So now we've actually got our 3 by 10 bricks. And you can't see it in the my scene here, but it's 3 by 10. Now the reason we did that is to get this color variance, and now you can see that we've got this wonderful variation in color. Right now it's gray because we don't we're using a gray color for our tile, but when we render it out, we'll have this color variance. So let's go ahead and render it out and see what it looks like. Okay, as this is finishing here, you can see that now we're getting this nice even variation in our materials for the brick. I'm going to go one more step and into this brick, and I'm actually going to add a map underneath this tile. So a brick map. So we're going to make some things, make it a little interesting here. So let me go ahead and just so let's go ahead and cancel that. And I'm actually going to play with the color of the grout because I still have that in there. Now, because we have this tiled, we can actually use the grout color from this image map. And so what I'm actually going to do is just steal it or copy it. So I'm going to right click and copy and paste the same map into the grout. So now we've got the map for the texture and the grout. And so you're asking, well, why do we use the tile? The tile is driving the variation. So we're getting a lot of texture out of our small texture map using the tile. I can also use this to control my bump value without having to create a bump map. So I'm going to copy that and paste, copy, not instance, because I'm going to change it around a little bit into my bump slot. And the way the bump map works is it's based off color values. So whatever is white is going to be protruding in shadows, and whatever is black is going to be recessed in shadows. So to control that, I'm actually going to make these maps a little different. So I'm going to copy one, paste, copy, just to make sure that they're different. So in here, I want this map to be brighter, and to do that, I'm going to go to the output, and if I click on this show end result, it actually shows the map that I've got current in that slot, and I turn that on and off from time to time just to see the actual map that I'm controlling. So I'm going to again right click on my output curve, make it a Bezier curve, and pull. I'm going to make it brighter, so we're going to pull it up. And you could, of course, you could also do, and this one I'm going to lower it to 0.01 because it's not a tile. I'm not worried about losing detail. It's really only the tile map that you lose a lot of detail. Now, if you keep it at 1, a lot of times you do lose detail as well. So it's a balance. So that's looking fairly good. Of course, for all our materials, we're going to add ambient occlusion, or we should be adding ambient occlusion. But I think that's where we want our brick map. So let's go ahead and render that out again. See how it looks. Okay, I think it's looking fairly good. The colors in my map are still washed out, and much like the concrete and the fabric, we can play with the output value in that to make it stronger. Another way to do that without changing it in the map is, of course, you can play with the exposure values and your mid-tone values, and that'll bring everything darker in your scene. But because this is a tutorial on and materials, we're going to control it by the materials. So let's go ahead into the diffuse slot and into our map, and we're actually going to play with the output. So open that up, enable color map, right click on our curve and change it to a Bezier corner, and we're going to pull that down. Let's pull it down. That may be too dark. Let's just go halfway. Okay. And the bump, I want a little more bump, so I'm actually going to go out, back into my bump slot here, down into my bump slot, red brick. There we go, something like that. So we're going to give it some ambient occlusion, which is under special effects, and we'll just check ambient occlusion. And that's basically it for paint. Depending on your paint finish, if you have an eggshell coat paint finish or a matte, some paints are more glossy than others. I actually like the eggshell, so I'm going to make it a little reflective. So here we're going to go 0.6, and there's our glossy. And it's not going to be as glossy, so we'll put it 0.3, and it'll kind of diffuse the gloss. So there it is. It's got a little bit of gloss, and much like we did the concrete, I'm going to add a fast interpolation. And then when you check that, you have to be sure that you go down and check your fast glossy interpolation. Neighboring lookup points, I'm going to crank that to 10. And then a high detail distance, I'm going to look out 15 feet. So it's going to use my samples, my standard samples, all the way out to 15 feet, and then it's going to interpolate up to 10 neighboring lookup points. Now this is very blurry, but that's okay because it's you don't really want to see the reflections clearly. It's just going to give the effect. You have to be careful when you use this with point lights or photometric lights, anything that highlights in the distance. You will get noisy reflections that come out as boxes, so you have to be very careful with how you use these. But that should do it for our paint. So let's go ahead and render that out and see how that looks. Okay, we're actually getting something very interesting. How I said that these fast glossy interpolations you have to be very careful with, we're actually getting some noise, and that's because it's interpolating behind the seat, and the seat is refractive, and so we're looking through onto a surface that has the interpolation, so that's why we're getting this noise. It's actually, in fact, too reflective. We're picking up this chair that's back here, and I don't really want my paint to be that reflective. So there's a trick that I'm going to do to get rid of that. Okay, I'm actually going to reduce the reflectivity by half. Let's turn off fast interpolate and make sure we're not getting any of those artifacts. So let's go ahead and render again. Okay, you can see that because I turned fast interpolate off, we're getting all these sample spots, and we will get as well. as it finishes rendering, you'll see that we'll still get these samples going through the seat, which is problematic. One way to do it is you can increase the samples tremendously, or, and you can see here we go, we are getting the same sampling pattern through the seat. One way to do that for soft reflections, for a wall like this, you don't really need it to be reflective. We can cheat with a trick. Let me go ahead and turn off this, cancel this rendering. We can turn on highlight plus final gather only. And what it does, you'll see right here, it says it disables reflections. It shows only the highlights, so it simulates glossiness, but it's based on the final gathering. So when you check this, it's going to turn off your glossy samples. So now it's not giving me any glossy samples. So that will fix our sampling issue. So let's go. I'll show you. That's going to get rid of all these samples and still give it the effect of a reflection. Okay, so it's actually giving us that highlight look that we want. It's fixed our sampling issue behind the seat, and it actually renders much faster. So I guess in Max there's more than one way to skin a cat, and you can see it's really simulating these reflections. So you're getting these nice reflections. It's all based off the final gathering though. So that's those are the materials that we need to cover. I'll cover one more option for the floor. We'll do a wood. How about that? And this will be our last material to cover. Okay, before we get onto our wood, I'm going to change the mapping on or the ID for the floor. Right now it's on concrete, so let's go back up here, and you'll see that concrete is 1 and wood is 5. So we're going to change that to now let's close our region. So let's go to our edit mesh and go to polygon. I've got the floor selected. Let's go ahead and change that to 5, which is wood. Okay. So now we've got our wood material and to our UV map so that all of our maps tile up properly. So let's go ahead and add the map for the wood. And this is just a very simple as can be wood map. So there is a wood map, and this was one of the standard wood maps that came with the Arc and Design materials. We're going to show it in the viewport, and again it's very tiny because we've got real world scaling map size. So we'll check it here, and I'm going to make it 2'6" by 2'6". There we go. And there are lovely wood planks. Now the color of it's a little bright. I want it to come out. I don't want it to be washed out in the rendering, so again I'm going to apply this output. There we go. We'll go back up one. And it's going to be a little reflective. Concrete. It's going to be, let's give it a reflection of 60%. And a glossiness of 0.4. And it's going to scatter 8 samples. And I don't want to use, I could use fast interpolate, but because this is a wood material, you can actually get away with scattered samples that support your texture map. So in this case, it actually could support it and be very good. I'm going to copy the color map right here, and I'm going to paste a copy of it into the bump slot, and that way it'll paste all of the scaling that I've got on my wood, but I'm not going to use this map. So I've already got my size, but I'm going to replace this with actually a bump map, and there's a bump map for the wood, and that's what it looks like. I want to increase the value of that, and another way to do that is to just increase the output amount to 2. That might be too much. Again, white is up and black is down. I and that's the way that the light is going to interpret the image. So let's go 1.5. Okay, that's pretty good. Now what I'm also going to do is copy this bump map into my reflection slot. Now to explain this, it's actually instead of being white, a diffuse color, it's going to be change. The reflection is going to vary depending on this image. So for example, in this area where it's white, it's going to be 100% reflective, and where it's black, it's not going to be reflective at all, which is actually more accurate in reality. And this, I'm going to keep that at 1. The texture map, I'm actually going to change the blur amount. I'm going to put that at 0.01. Okay. And so it's going to do some interesting things when we render it out. So let's go ahead and render not just the region, but we'll go ahead and render the entire image and see how that looks. Okay, this rendering is coming along nicely. The last step to this would be to add ambient occlusion, or just to turn that check mark on the rest of these shaders, and then to render it out with higher sampling rate in the renderer tab of the rendering setup. And I typically use 1 for the minimum and 16 for the maximum. But that pretty much covers all of it. We've gone through white cloth, chrome, glass for the table, and then the plastic for the blue seat, and then concrete floors, and then we switched that to a wood floor, and then we went through the paint on the walls, and then the brick, and that pretty much covers most of the materials. There's a lot more that goes on for the Arc and Design materials, and it's probably, I would say, Mental Ray's best shader that they've come out with. But there's a lot to look into, and there are a lot of things that you can add to, little bells and whistles on these shaders that I haven't covered. But that's all I'm going to cover for now, and I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks, bye.